All right. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our Executive Director, Nathaniel Stinnett.
Hey, thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much. And oh my gosh, thank you to the enormous number of you who are already here. This is going to be a really, really fun night. We've got a lot of new information and data and get out the vote plans to share with you. And I think you're really going to enjoy it. But as usual, we really want to respect your time. And so I'm going to go ahead and get going. First, I want to thank all of our host committee members. Many of you, and you'll see me scrolling through the tiers of our host committee, many of you gave very generously of your time, reaching out to folks to invite tonight, and of your money. And I just want you to know that all of the plans we go through tonight, all of the results we go through tonight, they are because of you. I'm even going to cycle through this a second time so you can see these amazing people's names. All of you should take real pride in the results that we are getting at the Environmental Voter Project, because this stuff is only happening because of you. So thank you. You are a big part of the Environmental Voter Project team, as are all of you who came because one of these people invited you. So welcome, everybody. Thank you to everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's event is going to start with me very, very quickly, giving like a 3-minute overview of what the Environmental Voter Project does, and then I'm going to get into what our potential impact will be this fall. Then Shannon, who you just heard from, is going to get into what our Get Out the Vote plans are going to be over the next 2 months. Then our keynote speaker, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, is going to be her usual amazing self, talking about how she started to get involved in the Environmental Voter Project and also some of the exciting stuff that she's working on now. Then we're going to drill down into like a choose your own adventure. You're going to get to choose through a poll one of 3 mini briefings that I give, like a 6-minute mini briefing. And then we're going to close it up and you can leave. But if you want to stick around for an extended Q&A, we will be here for that extended Q&A. All right. When we think about our potential impact this fall, first, it's obviously important for you to understand what the Environmental Voter Project does. Please know this is not an intro to EVP session, so I am going to rush through this faster than any of you have probably ever heard before. In a nutshell, what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment who aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. It might seem like a very narrow niche, and it is, but there are actually millions of these non-voting environmentalists out there. And the way that we do this is a 4-step process. First, we build what's called predictive models on voter files that allow us to individually identify who these non-voting environmentalists are. If you'd like to know more about this process, there will be links in the chat to mini briefings on how we identify these voters, because it's a really interesting, cool process. Moreover, if you want to ask questions about it in the Q&A, we can also address it there. But what this identification process enables us to do is individually target people who don't just care about climate and the environment, but they literally list it as their #1 priority over all other issues. And that opens up a world of possibilities to us when we get to step 2, mobilization. Because now we have a universe of people who don't need to be educated about any climate issues. They don't need to be persuaded to care more about climate change. No, they're already there. They just need to be mobilized to vote. And so that allows us to work with now over 7,000 volunteers to canvass, call, postcard, mail, and send digital ads to these non-voting environmentalists. And we can run hundreds of experiments called randomized control trials that help us isolate which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to do one thing and one thing only, and that is become voters. And we've become extraordinarily good at this. That leads us to step 3, habit reinforcement. We live behavioral science every day at the Environmental Voter Project. Many of you probably don't live behavioral science every day. Yet you still probably understand that if you're trying to change people's habits, if you're trying to turn them into habitual voters, you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there are these big federal elections going on. No, you need to talk to them every single time they've got an election so that they can build up the habit of voting. And we take that very, very seriously. Because ultimately our goal is step 4, and that's to change the electorate. We know that politicians aren't going to lead on climate out of the goodness of their hearts. They need to be forced to lead on climate. And nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing elections. And so our theory of change at the Environmental Voter Project is to goose demand in the electorate for climate leadership. We want to build up the number of consistent climate-first voters so much in the states where we work that politicians have no choice but to lead on climate, simply because of the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. You got to go where the votes are. And we want to make sure that as many of those voters as possible have climate at the top of their minds. This year in 2024, we are doing this work in 19 states. Some of you might look at this map and wonder, like, oh my gosh, why aren't you working in Michigan and Wisconsin? Well, there actually aren't that many non-voting environmentalists in Michigan and Wisconsin. And so we can't make as big a difference there as we can in some other states. But Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, Georgia, a whole bunch of other crucially important states, we've identified huge numbers of these voters, and I'll show you that in a second. Overall, across these 19 states, we have individually identified 4.8 million voter targets. Now, what does that mean if they're a voter target? It means they're already registered to vote. They are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority over all other issues. And 3, they are unlikely to vote this fall without a really sophisticated mobilization campaign to get them to do so. And when we say they're unlikely to vote, that means we've looked at their public voting histories, all 4.8 million of them, and we've seen that they didn't vote in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. If that's your voting history and you list climate as your number one priority, we're coming to get you. And we're going to make sure you show up this fall. And we've been getting great results. What we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we submit our work to something called randomized control trials. Very, very briefly, what this means is we set aside a control group of these non-voting environmentalists and don't talk to them. And then we only mobilize the remaining, usually 85 to 90%. And then after the election, we can compare turnout in these two groups and isolate what our sole impact was while controlling for all outside variables, even huge presidential campaigns. We can isolate what our impact is. And just from 2020 to 2023, we've been getting some extraordinary results where we can prove what our sole impact was while controlling for all these outside variables. We've been able to be solely responsible for increasing turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points among our targets in general elections, like the one that's happening 2 months from today. 3.6 percentage points in primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And these are big numbers in this business. I mean, let's just take that 1.8% number that we were able to increase turnout among our targets in Pennsylvania in 2020 in the general election. Well, what we're looking at over the next 2 months, just in these 5 battleground states that I've isolated here, are a huge number of targets. And let's say we don't even make 1.8 percentage points. Let's say we increase turnout 1.5 percentage points among our targets. Might be a little bit less in other states, might be more in others, but let's just take 1.5. What would that mean in a state like Arizona? Well, that would mean that we bring over 3,400 climate-first voters off the sidelines who otherwise would have stayed home. That is a huge deal in a state where the 2020 presidential election was decided by 10,457 votes. Look at Georgia, Pennsylvania. This really cutting edge work where we individually identify these non-voting environmentalists and then use behavioral science informed messaging to get them to the polls can have an enormous impact over the next 2 months. We know it from hundreds of these experiments. We now have the right messaging and the right targets, and now we just need your help to make it happen. And so what we're looking at tonight is something really exciting. These are some big numbers here. Before we started this event, we had already raised $493,000 from many of you. And holy moly, is that an awesome number. So congratulations and thank you to many of you. Moreover, we are very lucky that we have a handful, more than a handful, about a dozen very generous donors who put up matching funds. In fact, we even got an extra $25,000 in matching funds this morning from an amazing donor. And so what that means is that $493,000 is actually $986,302. That's probably not right, but I think that's what it is. So like, this is almost $1 million that we have raised before this event even started. But here's the deal. We still have some matching funds left. We have $550,000 worth of matching funds. So we can still bring in almost another $57,000 and get it matched. And then obviously we'd love to bring in even more than that. And so this is what we have the ability to do this evening. Is with the matching funds and with your support, we can have a $1.1 million event. That will bring a whole bunch of those non-voting environmentalists off the sidelines. And so this is going to be the first of many times this evening when we ask you to donate. But I'm going to finish this little part by saying, please take a moment over this evening to go into the chat, click those donation links, and donate generously. We are exactly 2 months from Election Day. You can donate by credit card. You can also click on a link that will give you information to donate by check, by wire, or donating shares of stock. You can also point your camera at that QR code, and the donation link will come up there. We've got 2 months to make this happen. We would love your support. Thank you so, so much. And now I'm really excited to hand it off to Shannon Siegel. Shannon is someone who many of you know because you have volunteered for phone banks or postcards or door-to-door canvassing. She is our organizing and field director. She is amazing, and she's going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be able to do if we are able to raise these funds that we need. So Shannon, take it away.
Thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you to all of you for joining us. I love seeing so many familiar names in the attendee list as well as some new ones, so welcome. Nathaniel just told you what we do, why we're doing it, and how much money we need to make it happen. I'm going to dig in a little bit into our fall GOTV plans and how exactly we are going to get that done and how we're going to get it done thanks to your support. So those of you that know me know that I'm our organizing director. I oversee our volunteering program, and unknown to many, volunteering is hugely important. This is how we get these voters out, but it's not actually free. So with these phone banks, we are planning between now and October to have 1,700 volunteer shifts, many of which are already filling up thanks to many of you. And we're hoping to make 1.5 million calls to environmental voters across many of these states. And then in 5 days, it's not a typo, we're looking to have 4,000 volunteer shifts, make 2.5 million calls to voters. So if you add that up, that's 4 million dials we're hoping to make. And if that seems like an unreasonable number to those of you that haven't volunteered with us, I want to let you know, we made 73,000 calls to voters last night. Over 100 of you joined to make calls on what's otherwise kind of a random Wednesday and Labor Day week. So we need volunteers to make that happen. And that volunteer team is already robust and growing. but we need to buy the server time. We need to buy the minutes to make those calls using Hub Dialer, which is our auto dialer system. With our canvassing program, we have 180 or more 3-hour volunteer shifts we're looking to fill across Austin, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Tucson. Those are some pretty important states, as Nathaniel showed on one of his last slides. Similarly, we could not canvass without the dedication of amazing volunteers that are donating their time. We also need to pay for the things that go on the voter doors, for the materials that these canvassers use, so that they can leave something with that voter, so that voter can remember that conversation 2 months from now. With our postcard program, which I know very many of you on this call are involved in, we've actually already trained all the volunteers and sent those postcards to them, 176,800 postcards to be specific, just for the November general election. Those postcards have been sent to over 600 volunteers, and they're going to put those postcards in the mail on October 2nd and October 15th. So like that plan is underway. But I'll let you know also, postcards aren't free. We have a program that I'm very proud of at EVP where we do not ask volunteers to pay for the postcards or the stamps unless they choose to. So we need support in order to continue having this incredibly successful volunteer postcarding program. It costs money. And then on the non-volunteer side, our direct mail and our digital ad program. We have 2.5 million planned pieces of direct mail that we're hoping to send out to all of these voters, some of which we're sending out within the next 2 weeks or so. So we need to lock in that budget so we can get these mail pieces out. Some of these are going to be what's called heads up mail, telling a voter that their mail ballot is on the way. We need your funding now in order to get those mail pieces out the door into voters. We're going to continue mailing them all the way through the middle of October. And our digital ad program, also not a typo. We are planning to send 84 million digital ad impressions to these 4.8 million environmental voters who we're targeting this year. Some of these are video, some of these are static ads, and we can add additional ads to this program pretty much right up until the last minute. This is an excellent way where we're going to continue putting your donations to work all the way up through November 5th to make sure we can send every last message to every last voter. And this is built on a program that we're not starting to plan right now. We're not just coming up with our fall GOTV plan at EVP. We actually started doing 2024 voter turnout in mid-December of 2023. And we started researching the messages that we're going to be using this year all the way back in 2016, 2018, 2020. So we have that proven messaging and we have the designs for our mail pieces, our digital ads, and our scripts, so that we know that they are going to make those measurable impacts that Nathaniel mentioned. And we've been training volunteers, again, for years, many of whom are coming back year after year to help this successful program. And we're continuing to train volunteers all the way up through Election Day. We're going to continue to have multiple trainings every single day to put new folks to work. And my amazing colleagues on the data team are able to update our voter list also pretty much every day whenever we have voter file updates, so that we can remove people who have already voted. I don't need you to spend your time or your donations on voters who've already voted. So if you're donating and we're putting that money to work, for example, in our digital ad program, we're not going to spend those dollars on folks who've already turned out. We're going to continue spending them on the folks that we need to get out to vote all the way up until like 1 hour before the polls close on Election Day. So this is the one time a year that you all will hear me make a donation ask, but truly this volunteer-based program is essential. Your volunteer work is essential and your donations are essential as well. We need both of these things together in order to make sure that our successful GOTV plans get to the voters. So, as Nathaniel's mentioned before, you've got another opportunity to take out your phone camera and scan this QR code or donate with one of these other options so that you don't have any regrets in November. Especially for those of you that are already donating your time to our volunteer program, we are so, so grateful for everything that you've given to EVP, and we would be continually grateful if you choose to supplement that with a donation as well. And if you need it, that link is in the chat as well. So speaking of volunteering, some of you might have seen Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson lead a phone bank with us before, but she also first came to EVP actually as a donor. So Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who will be speaking with you momentarily, is a marine biology expert, a policy expert, a writer, and very lucky to us, a member of the EVP advisory board. She's written co-edited the best-selling book, All We Can Save, which I know very many of you have read, and the coming very soon book, What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. So without further ado, I would love to pass it along to Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson to share a little bit about her experience and her experience with EVP.
Hello, everyone. I am so delighted to be here tonight. To rave about one of my favorite organizations in the universe, Environmental Voter Project. I first became aware of EVP, I think it was in 2011. I saw, back when I had a Facebook account, I saw a post about a Kickstarter fundraiser for this organization, and I was curious about it, and I clicked the link and I read it, and I was like, well, this is freaking brilliant. I was so blown away by the strategic thinking that went into crafting the really specific mission around impact, the data behind it, the way it evolved based on what they were learning as they were going to be doing all this voter engagement. And I was like, right out of grad school, I had very little money, and I made the largest donation that I had ever made in my life to that point, which was $100. And actually, when I was cleaning out my closet the other day, I found the receipt that was mailed to me, the thank you note from Nathaniel himself, because I was the only person who donated to the campaign that he didn't already personally know. I was like the random internet person who was like, oh, this seems cool. Sure. Like, have whatever tiny amount of money. I have like this huge to me amount of money in my bank account. And so I've been following EVP for over a dozen years now, learning more about their techniques and impact, volunteering, participating in phone banks, now hosting phone banks. And when I was asked to join the advisory board, I was just so honored. And I think probably, of course, I help to fundraise and champion the organization, tell all my friends, wealthy people, I'm like, empty your pockets. This is the way, because we have to win elections. And unless people who care about climate vote, politicians will not prioritize climate in their policy platforms when they're running or once they're elected, because there are so many competing interests. Climate always kind of gets bumped down the list in case there's a very strong signal from the electorate that this is a top priority. To get elected, to get reelected, you need to get it together and have extremely good plans on climate. So I've been spreading the word about this, and I think I'm curious if Nathaniel and Shannon would agree with me, but I think maybe the biggest impact I've had as an advisory board member was making them completely overhaul their branding and graphic design. Because when I joined, for years, I was like, I can't even send people this website. It's like amazing information. It's like completely embarrassing and unintelligible. It was like very classic, sort of like early internet vibe. And so now you'll see they have all this like very clear graphic design, which in my head, has helped people get their heads around the information. So that's my gift to EVP, to all of you. But more seriously, I mean, I think one of the things, that I'm really excited that Shannon mentioned that's coming up next is I'm releasing a book in 12 days called What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. Actually, I just opened the box yesterday. And I was also the art director for the book. If you are sensing some sort of theme here. And so it's just a really beautiful book. And the secret is in the back. There's a mixtape of all my anti-apocalypse playlist. So if you get the book, you get the playlist. But so much of the book is about how to get it right, we have to change the rules of the game. And that means changing policy. Right now, so much policy is rigged against the implementation of climate solutions. And unless we are electing people who get it on climate, we cannot unlock implementation, right? We cannot unlock public funding for these things. We can be the most perfect environmentalists at home, but that doesn't matter if we don't have also the systems in place that enable us to make good decisions. Because for many people, they can't switch to renewable. They're renters. They don't have roofs they can put solar panels on, or they can't afford solar panels. We need to have all of these options exist. I can't take a train most places I want to go because those trains do not exist. That's not something I can fix as an individual. We need, municipal composting. We need bike lanes. We need building codes for insulation. We need building codes that will prevent new gas lines from being put in new construction, right? All of these are policy questions, and policy solutions we can only unlock once environmentalists, once climate voters are showing up at the polls in really big numbers. So I also want to thank Nathaniel and Shannon for supporting me and my work over the years, for being such champions of this big new project that I've been doing. What if we get it right? I think they're going to share a link where you can pre-order it. There's also a link to the website where you can learn more about the book at getitright.earth. It's basically mostly interviews, a lot of them with farmers and policymakers and lawyers and architects and community organizers and designers and tech executives and corporate leaders and government officials. And it's what we could have if we do what EVP is helping us do, which is make sure that people who care about these things are elected. So if you need a little bit of inspiration for visions of climate futures and like why it is worth the effort to show up to phone banks, to send the postcards, to donate very generously, it's because of this future that we want to build together. And I'm very excited to be partnering with Environmental Voter Project on my book tour, because who can do a book tour in September and October of 2024 and not be talking about the election at every stop along the way? So thank you so much to EVP. We're going to be signing up volunteers at every stop of the book tour, hosting climate variety shows, sort of making it goofy and fun. That book website also has information on the book tour, so you can find me and EVP all over the country, hanging out, talking about climate solutions, talking about the election. And in particular, if anyone is in the great state of Maine, we will be hosting at Bowdoin College on September 20th, a conversation between our very beloved Nathaniel Stinnett and also Whit Jones, the founder of Lead Locally, which supports down ballot climate candidates, about climate and the election. And we'll be releasing that also as a podcast conversation if you miss it. So all that is to say, I am all in for EVP as a donor, as a volunteer, as a collaborator. I have been for over a decade, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. In fact, we are figuring out how to donate for every person who signs up to volunteer for through the book tour, Get Out the Vote effort. We're going to donate funds as well to support EVP's continued work. So I'm in. I'm glad you're all here. And Shannon, it's been a pleasure to work alongside both you and Whit for many years now. So thank you for having me.
And thank you, Dr. Johnson. Just like you are all in for EVP, we could not be more all in for you. And I don't know about everyone here. I'm seeing a lot of love reactions, clap reactions, ta-da reactions. I have goosebumps every time I hear you speaking just about what we could have. So thank you so much for your kind words, for being a member of our team. And thank you to all of you here who I imagine are very inspired by what you just heard. So I'll plug it again. Feel free to go right to that chat. You can donate to EVP, and you can also pre-order Dr. Johnson's book and check out the book tour. It'd be wonderful to see many of you in person all across the country. So, all right, now that y'all have had time to open that up, you'll get it in your emails as well, but we are ready to move straight along to the next portion of this evening. So, as I know, we've already had lots of questions in the Q&A. We know you all have topics that you want to hear in more detail. So we are about to put in front of you a poll where you can vote on the topic that you would like to hear Nathaniel give a 5-minute mini briefing on. So these are based on popular demand from volunteers and donors and EVP supporters like you. We're going to have like 15 more seconds of voting. You can choose to hear about Pennsylvania low propensity environmental voters, Arizona and Nevada low propensity environmental voters, and a question I hear a lot, the science behind EVP's messaging and our phone banks and our postcarding program. So I see we've got many folks still looking at them. All right, we're ready to share the results. So by a bit of a hair, our Pennsylvania briefing is what the folks would like to hear. So as Nathaniel is getting those slides up, I'll let you all know that if your topic wasn't chosen, we're going to send out via email a recording of these 2 other briefings that we are not going to present tonight. So you will get those in your email if you donate through this event. If you've already donated, great. Wouldn't hurt to donate again. But if you haven't donated yet and you really want to hear those briefings, any donation, big or small, will get those briefings sent to your email inbox within the next week. All right, Nathaniel, I hope you're ready to talk about Pennsylvania.
I am always ready to talk about Pennsylvania. I grew up in Pennsylvania. There's nothing I enjoy more than talking about Pennsylvania. All right, folks, this is going to be 5 or 6 minutes, really, really quick, going through the opportunities we see in Pennsylvania and everything else that we are currently seeing on the ground in this like swing state to end all swing states. Here we go. We are targeting 245,000 individual voters. These are those people I was referring to earlier, these individuals who are already registered to vote. They're highly likely to list climate as their top priority, yet they didn't vote in 2020 or any election since then. What does 245,000 mean in a state like Pennsylvania? Well, the state was only decided by 80,000 votes 4 years ago. So the number of people we are targeting is 3 times larger than the margin of victory was for Joe Biden 4 years ago. Oh my gosh, are there a lot of competitive elections in Pennsylvania? I think you're all aware that it's important for the presidency. It's also got a crucially important U.S. Senate race, a crucially important and tight attorney general race. 5 of their congressional districts are currently rated by the Cook Political Report as competitive, and both the state Senate and the state House are really tight and competitive. So one way I like to think about this is, let's imagine you're a voter anywhere in Pennsylvania. Chances are the ballot you pull on election day is going to have 3, 4, maybe 5 crucially important and extremely close elections on that ballot. That could be whether you're in Erie or Pennsylvania or Altoona, like you are going to have tons of important elections to vote on. So every voter we get to pull off the sidelines and get them to the polls, it's going to make a big difference in a whole bunch of races. All right, who are these people who we're targeting? Well, some of the broad demographic trends that we see in our target population, you can see down here in this row that's called LPEVs. That stands for low propensity environmental voters. And you can see these demographic numbers. Those are percent numbers. And below that, we're comparing them to what all registered voters look like in Pennsylvania. So the first thing you might notice is our target population in Pennsylvania, these low propensity environmental voters, are really, really young, right? Disproportionately young. About 80%, 80.3% of them are under the age of 35. Whereas in the overall electorate in Pennsylvania, only 24.3% of them are under the age of 35. So yeah, we're really, really young, this population that we're trying to turn out. Another thing you might notice is that they are disproportionately people of color. Particularly, they're disproportionately Black and Asian American and Pacific Islander. This is something that we see in a lot of our states, but it's particularly prevalent here in Pennsylvania. All right. Pennsylvania is also unique because, as you may remember from Shannon's brief presentation, we canvass in only 4 cities in the United States because we want to focus our door-to-door canvassing efforts in cities where there is what we call high canvassable density. That means we have a lot of targets really close by each other whose doors you can actually reach, right? They don't live in high rises or in gated communities. And 2 of them happen to be in Pennsylvania. And you'll see, between Philly and Pittsburgh, there are 39,000 of these targets of ours whose doors we're trying to knock on. And so unlike many of our other states, we have this extra additional, extraordinarily effective method of turning these non-voters into first-time voters. And that's something that's very, very special about Pennsylvania. All right, you probably don't need me to tell you how tight things are in the presidential race in Pennsylvania. As of today, 538.com, this is the polling average that they are reporting. And that is that Kamala Harris is up by 0.8 percentage points, actually 0.7, like 6. Really, really tight. Another thing that I want to stress about Pennsylvania is, as many of you know, we rarely poll at the Environmental Voter Project, but we were very worried about the lack of good public opinion data we saw among young voters in battleground states. And so we commissioned a poll. And it wasn't just so we could talk about a poll because everybody loves polls. We were looking for actionable data that we could use to make new voters show up on election day. And boy, did we find something scary but opportunistic in Pennsylvania. And that was this. 46% of already registered young voters in Pennsylvania don't know that their state has early voting. 46%. Now, to be clear, early voting in Pennsylvania is a little weird. You need to go to your county elections office once they have the ballots in, which usually is about 3 weeks before election day, to vote early. But you can still do it. And I guarantee you millions of early ballots will be cast in this most important of battleground states. Yet almost half of young people, not just young people, young already registered voters, have no clue that they can do this. You better believe that this is something we're going to try to be taking advantage of if we get the funding to have the robust outreach efforts that we want to have in Pennsylvania. And so this is what we see in the crucially important state of Pennsylvania. And yes, I managed to fit it into 6 minutes. So there we go. How's that for a mini briefing? We are now going to close things up. As we promised at the beginning, this is going to be a 45-minute presentation, and then you can stick around for an extended Q&A if you would like. But for the last 4 minutes of your time, I just want to reiterate a few important things to you. We have already identified our voter targets. These 4.8 million people, like, we literally know them by name and street address. We have their phone numbers. We can deliver digital ads to them as individuals. As Shannon was mentioning, we have now run over 300 randomized control trials telling us which messages are optimized to send to which subgroups of these already identified non-voting environmentalists. And so in every sense of the phrase, we are ready to go. We are ready to go. All we need is the funding to make it happen. And so now we find ourselves in this very special moment in time. I know none of you need me to tell you how exhausting the last 8 or 9 years have been, right? Feels like every day we are hyper aware of this democracy crisis and the climate crisis that we're facing. And I know it is hard and it's exhausting. But you're here because you're looking for solutions. You're here because you are very much aware of these problems and want to address them. And so these next 2 months are an amazing point of leverage. They are an amazing opportunity. And we at EVP, having identified our targets and knowing the messages that will turn them from non-voters into voters, we are now going to spend well over 80, probably 85% of our annual expenditures just over the next 8 weeks. And although we have about $1.1 million left to raise to meet our budget, when we look back at those randomized control trials, we're pretty confident that we could spend an additional $5.2 million before we even hit a point of diminishing returns, before we even get to a point where every dollar we start spending yields fewer new voters. We can raise and efficiently spend a whole lot more money. And as a reminder, every donation you make until we run out of matching funds, which may happen soon, is going to be doubled by these generous matching donors that we lined up. And so I would like you to go into the chat right now. Click on that link. We all know what happens on these Zoom calls, right? Like you close out and you say goodbye, and then you're like, oh my God, where did the donation link go? Well, like, click on it now. It's right there. And please donate generously. I'm asking this of you not out of charity, not as a favor, but because you're here for a reason. You are here for a reason. And we are exactly 2 months from Election Day. 2 months from now, 2 months from this very moment in time, you will likely be sitting in front of your laptop again or on your couch watching your television. And I can tell you it's now 8:45 on the East Coast. What that means is that polls in Pennsylvania will have closed 45 minutes ago. Polls in Georgia will have closed an hour and 45 minutes ago. Polls in North Carolina will have closed an hour and 15 minutes ago. And as you're watching these returns roll in, you will look back on the last 2 months and not want to have any regrets. And so please invest in your own values, invest in the change that you want to see happen over the next 2 months, and be as generous as you can, because we are sending every dollar right back out the door to fund these proven messages that we know work. So thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you to Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. If you haven't pre-ordered her amazing book, please do so. Thank you to our incredible staff. Thank you to our incredible board. And thank you to all of the volunteers and donors who spend so much time getting these amazing results. I hope you take incredible pride in what we're going to be able to do over the next 2 months and all that we've done in the past. So, for those of you who don't want to stick around for the optional Q&A, I won't take it personally. That's totally fine. We wanted this to be a quick 45-minute event, but we often host events where we run out of time to answer everybody's questions. And as a special thing for this event, we don't want that to happen this time. And so I'm really excited to be joined by our field and research manager, Danielle, who many of you know. She is the person who leads our canvassing operation. She does an enormous amount of our elections research. And she has also been lurking in the Q&A folder, seeing all of the questions that you've all been submitting. So while all of you are donating, please continue to go ahead and ask questions, and Danielle will throw some to me. So Danielle, how are you doing? What do we got here?
Hi. Oh man, it has been such a fun evening. So many great questions. Thank you all so much for your engagement tonight. I have quite a few that I am going to throw at you. But first, an anonymous question that we got that I think is going to be that might be on the minds of several attendees. Is it better to donate or to volunteer with EVP?
Well, they are both impactful. And the truth is, we're in the habit changing business. And although we all have November 5th on our minds, EVP is going to get right back to work again on November 6th. And we're going to keep on going, mobilizing voters next year for lots of important elections then. And I bring that up in the context of answering this question because I honestly believe you should do what feels best to you. And I'm not just saying that because I want you to think I'm a nice person. I think it's better for EVP if you do what's right for you, because that's more sustainable. That means you're going to come back to us. That means you are going to continue to be more involved in our work. And so obviously this is a fundraiser. We are hosting a fundraiser because we really need funding to get voters to the polls. But we also need volunteers. Debbie will put a link in the chat where all of you can go to sign up for volunteer opportunities. They are both very needed and very impactful. And we'd love you to do both. We would love you to do both. But if you have to choose, go with your heart, because we want you to keep on coming back for more.
Great question. And thank you to all of you, no matter how you take action with us. We really appreciate it. Another great question, this one from Bambi. Actually, several questions. I wish we could answer them all, but I'm gonna pull a couple of them. First, can you give us a summary of what is asked for in a phone bank call or in a phone call, and in a door knock? And then the second part that I'm going to include, what is the content of the postcards? What are we telling a voter in our postcards?
Really, really great question. So I am going to answer it, Bambi, but I also just want to mention to everybody that all of these questions will be answered also in the additional mini briefings that I'm going to record that will be sent out to everybody who donates tonight or has donated for this event earlier. But I am going to answer your awesome questions, Bambi. So first, let me deal with door-to-door canvassing. And all of our messaging is kind of deceptively simple, but underneath it is a lot of very sophisticated behavioral science. So with our door knock, we have a very long script to help volunteers answer questions that might come up. But the meat of it, the heart of the initial conversation, is something very simple. And that is, hi, is blank home. I'm Nathaniel, a volunteer with the Environmental Voter Project. All right, the first thing just happened there. We asked for someone by name, and we identified ourselves as a volunteer. We know that not only are people much more likely to speak with volunteers, but that message is then much more likely to change that person's voting behavior. We then ask if this person intends to vote in the upcoming election. All right. Now, Bambi, remember, we wouldn't be talking to these people unless we knew they were awful voters, okay? But most people will be embarrassed because deep down they know they're supposed to be good voters, and they're going to be like, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote. And that's like we've laid a trap for them, because we've now gotten them to say that they are going to do this thing that we know they've never done before. I'm going to come back to that, but it's a very important trap that we have set. We then move on to the next very simple part of the script. Someone says they're going to vote, and you say, oh, okay, well, are you going to vote on election day or by mail or in person early? This is what in the GOTV, the Get Out the Vote world, is known as plan making. The idea is if you get someone to actually think through the steps of a particular action you want them to take, it's like you're creating new neural pathways, and they are much more likely to actually then take an action, especially if they verbalize it. If they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna vote in person on election day. And chances are they're thinking of that like firehouse around the corner or the elementary school where they vote, and they're then much more likely to follow through on that. Finally, remember that trap that I told you we set where we got a non-voter to say that they were going to vote? Well, we come back to this person right before election day, usually with a call, and we remind them of that previous conversation. We say, hey, remember you spoke to that volunteer a few months ago and you said that you were going to vote? Well, Tuesday is election day, and that's your opportunity to follow through on your promise, and we know that's important to you. And now, Bambi, instead of being in a very difficult position of trying to convince someone of the value of their one vote, we're equating the act of voting with whether they keep their promises or not. A much more powerful prompt to action. This is how we can dramatically boost turnout, and we do it, as I'm sure you've noticed, without even talking about climate or the environment. Because these sort of social pressure-based nudges work much, much better. Now, very briefly, I'll touch on postcards and calls. Our calls are very, very similar. We walk someone through plan making. We get them to say whether they're going to vote or not. Often we provide a lot more logistical information if they're interested in it. We don't want to load them down with logistical information, but we make it very easy for them to see and, when their ballot might arrive in the mail or things like that. And then finally, postcards. Our volunteer postcards, we've used multiple different messages depending on the election. Okay. But right now for this presidential election, we are relying on a behavioral psychology technique, or largely on a behavioral psychology technique known as trending norms. The idea behind trending norms is that human beings are social animals. And whenever we're made aware of a normative behavior, we are usually going to feel pressure to try to align with that normative behavior, okay? So if most of our peers want to be thought of as smart, we're going to want to be thought of as smart. If most of our peers root for X sport team, we're probably going to try to root for that sport team, things like that. Trending norms are a little bit different. With trending norms, the idea is there's this norm, like most people want to be thought of as good voters, and it's trending. It's moving away from you. And the way we do it with our postcards is we literally have bars, like a bar graph, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And what we're saying, let's say you're in the state of Texas. We have an outline of the state of Texas, and we say each year more and more Texans are voting. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. These bars keep going away. And then we say, don't be left behind. We use FOMO, fear of missing out. The idea is we want to make it seem like there's this trend. There's this normative behavior that's trending away from you. And dear God, Bambi, if you don't vote, it's going to be like you're the last person left alone in the middle of your street, and everybody else will have voted. And you don't want to miss out. It's these little nudges that we've found. And I say we in the broadest, like humblest sense. We stand on the shoulders of a lot of great academics who have done a lot of this research that we're now using in the voting context. But these tools really work. And they can dramatically increase turnout, dramatically. So that's just some examples of the canvassing, calling, and postcarding messages. And again, I want to reiterate, if you donate, you will be getting a mini briefing on the behavioral science that we put into canvassing and, postcards and phone calls.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Yes, a little sneak preview of that mini briefing. Thanks, Bambi. Okay, another question from another anonymous attendee. Are polls a future prediction or a snapshot of the current trend?
Oh my gosh, great question. So I do want to say I'm not a pollster, but I have run a very large number of political campaigns and I've hired a whole bunch of pollsters before. Pollsters are not predictive of the future. Oh my God, they are not predictive of the future. At best, they are meant to be a snapshot of a particular moment in time. At best, at best. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of the fact that there is this sort of cottage industry of people who aggregate polls and historical data and economic data and other things like that and create predictions about what might happen. But that's very different from isolated polls. Very, very different. And I think a useful thing to sort of keep in mind is, gosh, I think it was actually in 2016, a fairly well-known pollster used an analogy that I think is really helpful and it's always stuck with me. And he said, a poll is like the scale in your bathroom. Okay? Let's say it's September 5th. We don't need to say it. It is September 5th right now. Let's say you go in and you step on your bathroom scale. It's not going to tell you how much you're going to weigh on November 5th. If it's a really good scale, it tells you how much you weigh right now on September 5th, okay? That's what a poll is. That's what a poll is. Now, if the same time every night you step on the same bathroom scale and write down, your weight, might you start like drawing some lines and start to see a trend? Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe you're like me and you'll order a whole pizza one night and then the line will start going all over the place. And so yes, polls are not predictive. Please don't get complacent or overly worked up about polls because at best they are a snapshot. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say, not only are political polls not meant to predict the future, good political polls are meant to give you actionable data that enables you to change the future. Campaigns wouldn't spend money on polls if all it did was tell them who was going to win the election. If that's all polls did, they would just pack up shop and be like, okay, looks like we're going to win or looks like we're going to lose. Why bother doing this anymore? Yeah. Don't pay too much attention to the polls. Pay attention to the voters. Pay attention to getting voters to the polls.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So many anonymous attendee questions. Don't be shy. We want to shout your name out. Another question, and this is one we actually hear quite a bit, but why are we only working in 19 states and not the entire country? So why not states like Wisconsin? We hear that one a lot. Can you shed some light on that question?
Absolutely. So for those of you who have forgotten what states we work in, don't worry, I'm not going to name all 19, but maybe we'll put our results tab to our website in the chat. And if you scroll down there, you can see a map that shows you the 19 states that we work in. First, let me say why we're not in all 50 states. We want to work where we can have the biggest impact. And there happen to be some states where we think that we would have a much smaller impact. And we're not doing this to have a small impact. We're doing this to have a really, really big impact. All right. Now, how do we choose those 19 states? We base it on 3 criteria. First, where is there a disproportionately large population of non-voting environmentalists? We want to work in states where we have lots of targets. Because let's take, I usually use Idaho as an example. Let's take Idaho. I don't know how many non-voting environmentalists there are in Idaho, but last time we measured it, it was very, very small. Let's say there are 300. There are more than that, but let's just use 300. Well, even if we're amazing at our work, which I think we usually are, and we get all 300 of them to start voting, well, that's not going to change anything. That's not going to change policymaking. It's not worth our time. It's not worth your time. It's not worth your money. We want to be in states where this target population of non-voting environmentalists is so big, so disproportionately big, that if we can start getting 2, 3, 4, 5, 10% of them to be voting, it could change everything. It could not only change who wins and loses elections, but perhaps more importantly, it can change policymaking. That is why we're not in Wisconsin or Michigan. Don't get me wrong, they are crucially important states, but they also happen to be states where there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists. And I would never claim to any of you that you shouldn't be spending your time and money on efforts in Wisconsin and Michigan. They are crucially important. In fact, they are so crucially important that I don't want to mislead you into thinking that you should support our work in those states. We don't think we could be as impactful in those states as other organizations, so we want you to support them. But in states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, holy moly, every other person you see on the street is a non-voting environmentalist, and we can have a huge impact there. So that's the first criteria we use. Second criteria, we need lots of elections, right? The only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to have them to vote in an election. And usually the best way to communicate to them to get them to vote in an election is in the lead up to that election. So the second criteria we use is we like to work in states where they don't just have elections in even years, but they also have lots of elections in odd years. So to give you an example, Oregon has a lot of non-voting environmentalists, so it fits our first criteria. But for good government reasons, they've moved all of their local and municipal elections to even years to coincide with big federal elections. Now, that's good policy. It gets a lot more people to vote for things like city council and mayor that are really important. I don't blame Oregon for doing this. But for those of us in the habit-changing business, that makes it a lot harder for us to communicate with our targets. In a place like Oregon, we could only communicate with non-voting environmentalists twice every 2 years. Whereas in a place like Georgia, where they have an active election calendar in odd years and even years, moreover, if you don't get 50% of the vote, things go to a runoff. I mean, there are some years where we can talk to our targets 6, 7, 8 times in Georgia. And the truth is that no matter how clever I think our messaging is, it rarely is as powerful as just like brute repetition. We want to get as many bites at the apple as possible. And so we love working in states where there are not just lots of non-voting environmentalists, but also lots of opportunities to talk to them. Finally, the third criteria, we aren't only interested in changing federal policymaking. Many of you are bigger policy experts than I am. I'm a political guy. But I'm sure you all understand that a lot of really sexy climate and environmental policymaking doesn't just happen on the federal level. It happens on the state level, where you can regulate utilities, where you can set building codes. It happens on the local level, where you can change zoning codes like house setbacks, where you can change parking regulations and traffic laws. And let me tell you, we're targeting 4.8 million people this fall in a presidential election. But obviously, the number of environmentalists who are unlikely to vote in local elections is much, much bigger. And so often in these municipal races, we'll be targeting, 70, 80, 100,000 people for a mayoral election where only 100,000 people are going to vote. And so we can have a disproportionately large impact in these low turnout elections. And so that's why if you look at this map, you'll see we're not just in a lot of purple states, although we are in an enormous number of purple states. We're also in some red states like Nebraska, where there are publicly owned utilities. So who wins local elections can have a big impact on the climate. And Louisiana, where you change zoning regulations in one small municipality or one small parish, and you might be able to zone a refining plant out of existence. We're also in blue states like New York, where next spring, the largest city in the nation is going to hold their mayoral elections. And you better believe that the person who runs New York City has a lot of potential for good and bad as a climate leader. And so we will be in blue states and red states and not just the purple states. And that's why. But a really, really good question. I'm sure that whoever asked it wasn't the only person thinking it. So thank you. Thank you for asking that.
Absolutely. Another question, jumping right into the next one. It's hard to follow, you so much information, so much good information in there, Nathaniel. But another great question from, again, anonymous attendee. Which forms of voter contact are the most effective?
Got it. Okay, great question. So I'm actually going to expand that question because I want you to realize that we consider both effectiveness and efficiency. And I'd suggest to all of you as donors and volunteers that you should think along both of those lines. So this is what I mean by both effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness is how much can you maybe expect to increase turnout per contact made, right? So per phone call, per letter delivered, per door knocked, things like that. That's effectiveness. Efficiency is, okay, well, those new votes, that increase in turnout, how much can you get per dollar spent or per volunteer hour spent? Because sometimes something could be really effective, but also really inefficient. And you want to take that into consideration. Okay, we use 5 methods of voter contact at the Environmental Voter Project. All methods that can be individually targeted, because remember, we're targeting individuals and eventually we're going to run this stuff through randomized control trials so that we can see what our impact is. That is door-to-door canvassing. So that's by volunteers, volunteer phone calls, volunteer postcards, and then as a staff, we also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns. The honest, but somewhat disappointing answer is it depends, right? It depends on what kind of election that you're in. Depends on how much money is being spent, things like that. But by and large, what we see is consistently the most effective form of voter contact. So again, the most you should be able the most you should expect to be able to increase turnout per contact made is still door-to-door canvassing. Even with all these fancy bells and whistles we've got in politics now, there's still nothing that beats one human being talking to another human being over the door. So that is the most effective. That's followed by direct mail, digital ads, then comes postcards and phone banks. All of them, however, and I really mean this, we have been able to prove, at least with our own messaging, can increase turnout with statistically significant results. So they will increase turnout. We have the studies to prove it. If you want to see the receipts, you can go to our results tab on our website and see them. All right, now let me talk about efficiency. Even though door-to-door canvassing is the most effective per contact made, best case scenario, right? Even if it's a weekday evening when everybody is home, maybe over a 2.5 hour shift, you can get 20 people to answer the door. Maybe 5 of them are the wrong person because you're looking for the person's, child and they're not there or something like that. So maybe over 2 hours, you can reach 15 targets. Not terribly efficient. Still important to do, but not terribly efficient. The most efficient forms of voter contact, so that is the ones that take the least amount of volunteer time to increase turnout or the least money spent to increase turnout, are phone calls. On a good list, if you do an hour and a half or 2 hours on a phone bank, you might be able to speak to 40 or 50 of the people we're trying to target. And we've seen in some of our studies that that our phone bank messages can increase turnout 1.1 percentage points over our control group. We're targeting 246,000 people in Pennsylvania. You know what 1.1 percentage points means? An extra 2,500 first-time climate voters showing up to vote. So it can be really, really impactful. The final thing I'll just say, you have this sliding scale of effectiveness, you have this sliding scale of efficiency. All of them, at least of the first, like $5 or $10 million we spend, right, are not going to be duplicative. They are going to be additive, by which I mean you always want to have a multimodal approach of communicating with your target voters. Not just because some of them can't be reached by door knocks or phone calls or digital ads, or even, believe it or not, there are some people who can't be reached by direct mail. Many of our Native American targets in Arizona, for instance, do not have U.S. Postal Service mailing addresses. They have other mailing addresses. And so it is always helpful to layer on all of these different approaches. And so I know that there is this tendency to think, especially in a big presidential campaign, like, oh, is this person being contacted too much? Or is this duplicative? No, you do not need to worry about that. You do not need to worry about that. I can't guarantee you, but I can pretty much guarantee you, no one has, out of frustration, gone from being a non-voter to a voter back to being a non-voter again. Nobody has said, well, I was going to vote, but they just called me one too many times. Forget it. Forget it. Now I'm not going to vote. No, you don't need to worry about that. We wouldn't be asking you to do stuff unless our randomized control trial showed that these people need to get X many touches by phone, X many touches by door knock, X many letters. And yeah, you really want to layer this stuff on top of each other. But really, really great question. I'm sure you're not the only one who was curious about that.
Yeah, and not to be biased, but as the person who oversees our canvassing operations, always nice to hear canvassing still remains to be, the most effective form of voter outreach.
It's number one. It's still top of the charts.
Okay, another question. What do we know about these environmental voters? Who are they? I think I remember you touched on this briefly during the main presentation, but just to hear, we want to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I will give some broad demographic trends that we see in our states. But first, let me just say as a caveat, we aren't able to identify these voters just by looking at demographic data. We look at thousands of individual data points to isolate these voters. So I am going to start giving you some demographic information and some broad trends that we see. But don't flip that around and assume that demography is destiny, that all we need to do is know some people's demography and we'll be able to find the environmentalists. It's much more complicated than that. But by and large, in almost all of our states, this is what we see. First, these non-voting environmentalists are disproportionately young, okay? So I think the number I gave in Pennsylvania was 80% of our targets this fall are under the age of 35. That could get as high as like 90% in a state like Nebraska. It can get as low as, say, 70% in some states. But this population is disproportionately young. However, even saying that hides some really interesting nuance, because imagine yourself looking at a graph where over on the left are the youngest people, on the right are the oldest people. Yeah, the largest number of our targets are going to be over on that young side of the graph. And then it's going to get lower and lower when you get into the 40s, 50s, Gen X folks. They're the least represented in our target population. But then it starts going back up again. And the second largest population of people in the United States who list climate as their top priority are people 65 and older. Now, they're not the second largest age group in our target population because older people tend to vote more often. But in some states, they're the second largest group. And we definitely see that kind of like Nike swoosh if we're looking at an age demographic chart. So that's sort of the age trends. As far as racial and ethnic trends, we consistently see that these, well, first, that people who list climate as their top priority are disproportionately people of color. Then when you layer on top of that vote propensity, so when you layer on top of that environmentalists who are less likely to vote, yes, they're disproportionately people of color. Now, if we had been having this conversation 2, 3, 4 years ago, I would have said that's largely being driven by Hispanic voters and AAPI voters, so Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. We're not seeing that as much anymore. Instead, we're seeing that the demographic groups who are most overrepresented, or the racial and ethnic groups that are most overrepresented in our target populations, are Black voters and AAPI voters. And in states where there are very big Native American populations, certainly Native American voters are overrepresented in our target populations. Hispanic voters, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are changing. They're changing pretty rapidly. And there are some states like Arizona where our target population is still 9 or 10 percentage points higher if you look at the number of Hispanics than in the overall group of registered voters. But in some states like Florida, there's a lower percentage of Hispanic voters in our target population than there is in the overall electorate in Florida. It's really, really changing. Final sort of demographic data point. Well, no, I'll do two more demographic data points. In most of our states, not all of them. So for instance, not in Pennsylvania, you may remember, but in most of our states, we see a gender gap. I use the term gender gap because it's kind of a term of art. We actually don't have a lot of gender data. We have sex data. But by a gender gap, I mean women are overrepresented in our target population in a way that's even bigger than in the overall electorate. So in most states, women are 3 to 5 percentage points more prevalent among registered voters than men. Women are just, well, there are more women, period, and there are certainly more women registered voters. But when you look at our target population, there are some states where women make up 58, 59, 60% of our targets. They're just much, much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment. Final demographic trend that I'll just bring up, and this is a little bit weaker than the other ones that I mentioned. At least in the way that we identify environmentalists at the Environmental Voter Project, which is people who are likely to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority. So that's obviously a very high bar. These people are disproportionately lower income. Obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but if you defined environmentalist in a different way, perhaps a less stringent way, you wouldn't see that income disparity. But at least when you're looking at people who are likely to list it as their #1 priority, they're lower income people. And if you look at a lot of data, especially Pew Research, a great polling shop, does a lot of really good public opinion research on this, you'll see that, surprise, surprise, people who prioritize climate and environmental issues are the ones who are most likely to experience the impacts of the climate crisis and toxic air and poisoned water. They are feeling it every single day. And when you internalize that, all of a sudden you start to realize, like, well, yeah, okay, of course it's people of color. Of course it's lower income people, because they are living in communities where these toxic assets are being built. And so it's something that I think is really important for those of us in the environmental movement to internalize. I think many of us still have this idea of climate and environment as being a luxury issue that like wealthy white suburbanites driving around in their Priuses care about, but like other people like don't have the luxury of worrying about such things. No, this is not a luxury issue. The people who care deeply about climate and the environment are the ones whose kids are having asthma attacks, or the ones who are seeing like the land disappear in their neighborhood year after year.
All right. Another question, and we're getting close to the end here. I think we have time for a couple more. One from Bethany, how did you develop such rigorous tests for your methods? It would be, and she gave us a nice shout out. It would be amazing to see other organizations testing their methods so much for efficiency and effectiveness. Thank you, Bethany. Very nice.
Yeah, thank you, Bethany. So first of all, we didn't invent any of these tests. These are the same methods that social scientists use to test the impact of any behavior change work, right? If you're trying to get someone to exercise more often, or you're trying to get them to eat healthy, or if you're trying to get someone to buy shoes or things like that. This is Madison Avenue uses these tests and things like that. But I have to admit that, so much flows out of the unique theory of change that we have at the Environmental Voter Project. If your goal is to, over time, consistently grow the political power of the climate movement, well, then you have the luxury of not just worrying about one election and then closing up shop and going home and going back to zero and then just waiting for the next big election to come along. No, the fact that we are working year round enables us to find elections that we can do these experiments in. And so, although it was very kind of you to word your question that way, Bethany, I would claim that, if I wasn't running the Environmental Voter Project, and if instead I was running the Bethany for President campaign, I wouldn't run randomized control trials. Are you crazy? You would fire me in a second if I came up to you and I said, oh, guess what, Bethany? I'm going to do this really cool, nerdy thing. I've taken 15% of the voters we're supposed to talk to, and I've put them in a control group, and we're never going to talk to them. You would go nuts, and rightly so. Because if you're trying to win one election on a Tuesday in November, first of all, you're probably not going to spend all your time talking to crappy voters like we do at the Environmental Voter Project. You're going to start at the other end of the spectrum. You're going to start with the good voters and go down. But second, you don't have the luxury of being able to test in the way that we do. Now, when we have these big, super important elections coming up, like a presidential general election, we are not running weird little messaging experiments. We do that in other elections at other times of year. But again, we're very lucky in that we've chosen this unique path for this nonprofit, because we get the ability to not only have a really, really big impact in one-off elections, but we get to run this full-time field laboratory, informing us of which messages work, and we can hold these webinars and meet with other organizations and teach them about which messages work. And we can iterate on this and not just then come back the next time there's a big election and be even better at turning non-voters into new voters, but we can start having this cumulative impact where we really, really change the electorate over time. All right. Do we have time for one more, Danielle? Or is that it?
Well, can we squeeze in two, because they're
absolutely, absolutely. Go for it.
I think they're good. They're good ones to end on. Joe threw out a fun question to think about. If EVP were to raise $5.2 million today, how many more votes can we turn out in swing states this year? He's guessing 80,000. What do you think, Nathaniel?
Yeah, it would be probably 80 to 86,000 votes. And Joe, we've got the plan. There ain't even dust on it. It is ready to go. It is ready to go. We've got the plan. I mean, if we get an extra $1 million tomorrow, I already know exactly what we're doing. $250,000 to make sure that every person, every environmentalist in Nevada, actually knows that their ballot's about to arrive in the mail because, dear God, like none of them realize that the ballot's about to arrive. Probably 500 or 600,000 in Pennsylvania to make sure that like all of these people know that they can early vote. We already have like the fancy behavioral science stuff. But like, as I just showed you in that poll earlier, like none of our targets know that there's early voting in their state. Like, dear God, can you believe that? And so I want to have a whole nother like run of digital ads, just letting all these young people know that like, yes, dear God, there is early voting. Like we've got this all set up and ready to go. Boy, could we use that additional funding. And again, that additional 5.2 million, we could blow beyond that. But what that 5.2 million number is from this point forward, if we get $5.2 million, all of that money can be spent without seeing even one iota drop off in efficiency. Every single one of those dollars we spend is going to create the same number of additional new voters. Only after 5.2 will we start creating fewer new voters per dollar spent. All right, what's the last one, Danielle?
Final question comes from a regular volunteer of ours, Craig. Thank you for joining us tonight, Craig. Craig was able to join a little bit late, so he's asking if we can please repeat how much money are we trying to raise tonight? And he also said, I assume this event does not happen very often, so we will miss out, FOMO, nice little throwing that in there, if we don't donate tonight. And he's asking, so if we don't donate tonight, is it easy to donate on our website?
Yes. So it is easy to donate in so many ways. In fact, you will see a link was just put in the chat to donate. Okay, how much are we looking to raise tonight? So we came into tonight already having brought in $493,000. Moreover, that $493,000 was matched. How about that, Craig? How about that? But we had, I think, a dozen donors put up $550,000 worth of matching funds. And so that means there was still $57,000 worth of matching funds just sitting there. And dear God, Craig, I do not want to have any of those matching funds left. We can't afford to leave those matching funds on the table. It's free money. I want to get them. I want to get them. So at the very least, what we want to do at this event today is bring in $550,000 so that we can unlock all $550,000 of those matching dollars and have a $1.1 million event. Could we raise more than that? Absolutely. And again, I want to be very clear. There is no limit on the amount you can donate. You can donate by credit card. We can also put a link in the chat that lets you know how to donate by check, by wire transfer, or by stock donation. Many people have appreciated stock. If they sell it, it's all going to go with capital gains and all that. And you can just transfer it to us. We will take it off your hands gladly, and we will use it to create new voters. All right. Wow, you guys are gluttons for punishment. I can't believe that we have found as many nerdy people as we are at EVP to stick around for this extended Q&A. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for all of your amazing questions. I'm just going to take the next minute or two to close, and I'm going to ask you again to take a moment right now to go into the chat and donate. Donate generously. We've got 2 months until Election Day. You don't need me to go over all of the things that are at stake this fall. You already know them. But what I would like to reiterate to you is that we've identified our voter targets. We've run hundreds of randomized control trials telling us which messages work best to turn them from non-voters into new voters. We have the plans to make it happen. Now we just need the funding. We just need the funding. So please go into the chat, donate generously. There is nothing I would like more than to be able to come back and speak to all of you in mid or late November or early December and tell you about all of the amazing things we were able to accomplish together. And that's another good thing about these randomized control trials. We will report back to you. We will let you know with statistical significance that could pass peer review how much we were able to increase turnout in all of our target states. So thank you for spending the evening with us. What we're now going to do is we're not going to turn off the Zoom, but we are going to turn off our cameras so that those of you who still want to access things in the chat can access those links, in particular, that donation link. And then after a few minutes, we will shut down the Zoom. But please go into the chat, donate, and have a good night, everybody.